Well, I haven't been given formal interview duties, but we're gonna tag team it a bit, aren't we? But I'm going to kick off. I would say I'm quite glad it's a little chilly in here because there's no chance any of you could fall asleep, and I'm watching. So Judy, to kick off, then you're working on a big project at the moment in this very area. So why don't you tell us all a bit about that?
Right, well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me, because I'm really delighted to be here and to be able to tell you about our project at the Alan Turing Institute on women in data science and artificial intelligence. We've been going for nearly 3 years, and we've just had funding for another 3 years, and we're part of the public policy program at the Turing Institute, which has got very similar aims to ODI. You know, we're working in the same spirit, actually. And our project has really got sort of 3 threads, if you like. I mean, the first thing we've done is really to try and map the participation of women in these professions. And we wrote a big report called, you know, what is it? Where are the women? Mapping the gender job gap in AI. And we found that only 20% of professionals in data science and AI are women, which is kind of disappointing, given that women are half the workforce now in Britain. But when we looked at things like the top machine learning conferences, we found that the proportion of women is tiny. It's 8%, like there are hardly any. So in terms of thinking about algorithms and who's designing them, you know, there's a very small number. So, you know, one of the things that came out of our initial work was really was a plea for particularly big tech companies to be more transparent about the demographics within those companies. Because in fact, it's been very, very hard to really map participation because companies are very loath to disclose what the real situation kind of is. You know, secondly, we are trying to sort of counter the notion that this is simply a pipeline problem or a generational problem, because we found that actually there were quite significant differences in retention rates, promotion rates within companies. And we talk about this as being a kind of chilly workplace culture, if you like, that there is something about what's going on in workplaces that means that some groups find work less comfortable place to inhabit than others. And we're working on some projects at the moment to try and explore the nature of this interaction and how we can kind of improve it. And the third stream is really to argue that there's a direct link, and I've been arguing this, you know, in my books for many decades, that there's a direct link between the lack of diversity in the workforce and the kinds of technologies and technological options that we have, the kind of design options that we have. And I'm sure you'll all be aware that there's been a lot of discussion recently about social bias in algorithms like facial recognition technology, you know, job ads that go, you know, less to women than to men for highly paid jobs. And we argue that really there's a kind of feedback loop so that, you know, this lack of diversity in the workforce directly feeds into these social biases that are increasingly being identified in things like algorithms.
Yeah. So, I mean, before we get on to so much in that, but before we get on to some of the sort of remedies or what we think is going on, I mean, let's really unpick why 20%, do you think? Wait, you know, I've got some theories, but why so low? Why only 20% women? And is it chicken and egg? Because that's the problem, isn't it? Is it the environment that's putting people off applying, or is there a smaller funnel of people?
Well, if we sort of broaden it out to STEM, which I think, you know, that a lot of people are aware of and concerned about, I mean, what's very important to say is that this isn't kind of universally the case. That there are some countries, as we know, like, you know, India and Korea and, you know, there are, I think, the sort of Philippines, you know, there are, and some of the Arabic countries where actually the proportion of women in these kinds of professions is much higher. So, you know, what's always kind of struck me is what is it about kind of particularly Anglo culture, because it's the same in Australia and in the US, you know, what is it about these cultures that somehow socialise boys and girls into different notions of what's valuable, what's to study. And, you know, these are long sort of cultural processes at work that we've seen and worked on for a long time, you know, which is that we think of maths as somehow, you know, something that boys are better at. And, you know, I'm sort of endlessly sort of annoyed by sort of tech entrepreneurs who go on about how wonderful they were at chess, you know, that there's this kind of notion that what are the skills you need? And whereas it may be that language skills can quickly be translated into programming skills, we have this sort of very fixed notion. But sort of having said that, they're the kind of, that's why, if you like, you know, fewer women do this kind of work. But I think it's important to say that once, you know, women get into, and I'm thinking of the quite old work on women engineers, actually, that it's kind of one thing to train women engineers and get them into engineering firms. Then there's another problem, which is retaining scientists and engineers and what's going on at that level in terms of rewards. And one of the things that's important to say, and I'm sure that we'll come on to this, and I just read an interview with a top woman scientist the other day who was asked about, you know, what were the impediments. And she said she was immediately told that if she wanted a career in science, she couldn't have children.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a whole thing about once you get into that profession, and it's not just STEM, but it's not just AI, it's not just tech, it's banking, it's the media. I mean, I can talk quite a lot about that, but before we do, just to go back to this notion of, you know, coding and you know, data is for boys, and you know, it's whatever it is, writing or languages are for girls. I mean, I was struck. I did a coding, very brief coding course, and I was struck by how much like a language it was. In fact, it reminded me of Latin because it was so precise and logical, and it was about learning steps. And yet, if you'd asked me, I would have said, yeah, you've got to be a maths geek. It's a maths geek thing, that, you know, to be a coder. And I wonder why we just get this messaging so wrong. And you know, and why the role models, if you look at who teaches computer science in schools, for instance, you know, it's usually young men. And I just wonder what, you know, what could be done about that, because that's quite a fundamental thing to change how cool it is.
It is, but I think what's important, as well as comparing other countries, is to look historically. And, you know, friends of mine have just been to Bletchley Park and said, you know, I was at a party on Saturday and someone said, gosh, you know, I went to Bletchley Park and, you know, something like 80% of all of the people who were working there on maths and coding were women. And, of course, we have those wonderful photos, you know, during the war, and those huge computers that used to take up a whole room in Manchester. And, you know, we know that programming then, which was much more a kind of low status, ordinary kind of job, was predominantly done by women. So what we have is a historical transition where a kind of, that the work and the skills become highly valued, become professionalised, and with that, you know, the composition of who's doing the work changes. I mean, we've seen that in law and medicine in an incredibly short period of time, you know, changes in the gender composition of the workforce.
Well, one thing is definitely true. I think it's fair to say that big tech companies are desperate to hire women into these positions. There's not a discrimination at the hiring stage. Well, there might be, because of hidden biases and lookalikes, but in terms of their stated aim, and it's true in the boardroom as well, you know, there is a desperate attempt to find women. And, you know, companies like Channel 4, they don't have quotas, but they absolutely have, we must have female on our shortlists. We must cast the net wider and take on people who have less experience. So I don't think it's there that the problem is. I think it's in the funnel, and then moving on, the retention of women in these jobs, largely, like many things, because of a motherhood penalty. Now, if you ask our 8 million users, we've surveyed them, 96% of the mums on Mumsnet think there is a motherhood penalty in the workplace. And actually, there are some really interesting stats on how people view the effectiveness of women once they become mothers. So 46% of people think they're likely to be less effective. A woman is less likely to be effective once they become a mum, and only 11% of people think that a man is less likely to become effective when they become a dad. And conversely, actually, lots of people think men become more effective, whereas very few people think women become more effective. And it's this like inbuilt assumption, which is based in a lot of fact, I think, that the woman is going to pick up all the slack in the home, they're going to pick up all the crises, they're going to be less committed to their job. And that's a huge societal, cultural thing that I would love us to get to grips with, but it feels like quite a thorny one. You know, it's one thing saying to everyone, you know, let's get more girls into coding, let's recruit more. But if the fact is, as soon as they become a mother, society expects them to not take that career promotion, to not push, to go and work part-time because they are expected to be the main person looking after the family. And that's quite intractable, don't you think?
I do, but you've raised so many things there. I'm just wondering how to respond. I mean, you know, one thing that we've seen during this COVID period, and there was a very sort of nice article about that, was that in terms of submissions to academic journals, the number of submissions from men went up and the number of submissions from women went down. You know, it was quite interesting, the effect of productivity. And we know the figures, and there's been, you know, very good economists working on this, that actually, you know, women shouldered a disproportionate amount of the burden of kind of homeschooling.
Working men got 3 times as many hours to do their work than working women during lockdown.
That's true. But I just read a very interesting, I've always got a study. I just read a very interesting piece actually looking at women and male scientists, but over the long term, right? Not short term, but a long term. And it was interesting because it was showing that actually, you know, mothers were less productive for a period of time, but then more than made up for it later. That if you looked at, you know, 15 years in sort of thing, they were much more productive than their contemporary men. So, you know, it's partly a short-term thing of looking at productivity. I think that's quite an important thing. And actually, you know, the mothers who'd survived, of course, were publishing much better science because, I mean, so many of them had been funneled out for various reasons.
And I think that is across the whole piece. It's about, can you keep women in the workplace during that really, really difficult time of early childhood?
Yeah.
And when childcare options are so patchy and so expensive. And, you know, one of the things we campaign on is what can the government do to because once people are gone from the workplace, it's really hard to get back in. And,
yeah.
you know, particularly because every year there's a new technology that you haven't necessarily kept up with. So what can you do to keep women in the workplace? What can you do to fund in a bit way, maybe a bit like student loans? You understand that this is a period of your career where you're going to possibly need some funding support and you pay it back later. Because I think you're right, you know, there are many skills to be learned from looking after young children, and it often makes people better in the workplace.
It's true, but what we haven't actually talked about is fathers, and I would like to say a little bit about that. I mean, because one of the things we have seen in this period is an increase in fathers spending time with children. And, you know, on optimistic days, I'm hoping that this sort of period will actually lead to kind of some change in that. And we've seen long-term change from the 50s and 60s. I mean, over the last half a century, there's been a huge change. You know, I think paternity policy is fantastically important.
So I think there are 2 key things there. One is, you know, dads need to do more, frankly. You know, whenever we measure who's doing what around the home, around kids, around domestic duties, around, you know, dealing with the school, around arranging play dates, around all that kind of stuff. Women are still doing the bulk of it. But the good news is we see even in our own users that there is an improving situation for younger parents. So younger parents, dads are doing more. But I completely agree with you. Until we have the type of paternity offer that you see in Scandinavia.
Absolutely.
Where dads are less likely to be involved. And so all the evidence says you get dads involved in that first year, they're more involved throughout the child's life in doing things like liaising with the school, packing the packed lunch, the mental load stuff that actually women find so hard to do on top of a demanding full-time job.
And I mean, my friends who've had sabbaticals in places like Denmark and Sweden say to me, it's extraordinary. People do go home at 5 o'clock. You know, men and women go home together, 5 o'clock, look after the kids. And I mean, they might do some work in the evening as well. Yeah. But there's just a very different expectation about working hours.
Yeah. I want to, if you don't mind, I come back to this idea of almost like the internet is being designed, by men, shall we say, for men. And I'm just going to tell an anecdote about a competition I judged. So it was a entrepreneurs competition, and I was one of, I think there were about 10 people on the judging panel. There were 2 women. It was Richard Branson's competition. There was £1 million of advertising on Virgin up for grabs. And the finalists came down to cauliflower rice, which some of you may have tasted, which is not that pleasant, but a wonderfully good product for parents in particular, because it's kind of rice, but it's healthy, and an advertising hologram. And of the 12 judges, the 10 men all voted for the advertising hologram. The 2 women voted for cauliflower rice. Cauliflower rice has gone on to be a huge business. The advertising hologram I'm yet to see, but even if I do, I'm not that interested in it really, because it's not going to make a difference purposefully for the world. It's not going to change a lot of people's lives. And I think this is part of the issue. The issue is a funding issue. The funding, in this country, if you look at venture capitalists, never mind participation in the boardroom. Participation in venture capitalist firm, I mean, it's not just that it's all male, it's frankly, it's all white, and they're all at a certain, they all went to the certain schools. And they just can't, they're lending money to businesses to make stuff, and they don't understand the problems of most of the world, actually, to be honest. They understand the problems of rich white men. Now, I worry that that's happening a bit in some of these big companies who are building these big tech algorithms. The people at the top are basically rich white men, and they're building stuff to solve those problems for rich white men. Discuss.
Well, discuss. Well, I mean, I completely agree with you. And I mean, a couple of years ago, I spent a year at Stanford, actually, in Silicon Valley, sort of doing interviews in big companies. And I mean, I had read that, the Facebook workforce, that most of the workforce were kind of 30-year-old young men. I sort of couldn't, but I mean, they literally are, you know what I mean? Like so there's the youth thing, there's the sort of, gender, youth, but I mean, I think the youth thing is also very important. And I mean, people joke with me about how, and it's not just youth, but it's youth that are sort of on campuses, kind of interacting with other people who do sort of similar kinds of work. I mean, I would go sort of drinking with these people, part of my ethnographic, work, I have to say, and I mean, these young men would complain about the fact that they didn't have lives, but it was that sort of old fantasy of, we'll work really hard till we're 35 and retire or something and not have a life. But also the other fantasy, which I think is important to go back to what you were saying about what you need to do this kind of work, is a kind of self-conception. I sort of said to them, look, I wrote this book years ago, I mean, it is, years ago, about women and men managers and how actually, even CEO jobs could be job shared. There's no reason in principle why only one person can sort of do these jobs. And I remember these guys sort of saying to me, oh, but you don't understand, we're just doing cutting edge science. We are just brilliant. We're sort of like, we're geniuses. Like, no way could this be a job share. No way could we distribute this work equally. So I think there's this, and they're paid like geniuses, which, is another thing we could talk about relative to care workers or whatever. But, I think there's this whole sort of conception which we get with the kind of Steve Jobs and all these iconic figures, that this is work that has to be done 24/7, that, only very few people are sort of talented to do this. And what you get as a result is a very narrow sort of imagination and conception of what are kind of needs, what are the problems that there are technological solutions for. And I think quite often, and I have to say, maybe Meta is a classic of this, of thinking of things you can do with the technology first rather than thinking of social problems first, which, we would like to think, what are the social problems? Let's use technology, let's use data science to kind of address them, rather than, well, what can we do? What cool thing can we do with the technology? And let's create a sort of market for it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm struck when you talk about that sort of culture environment, the young. But it could apply actually to politics. It could apply to banking. It could apply to sort of M&A lawyers as well. All of it's designed to say, you can only do this job if you're prepared to give it sort of 24 hours a day, and not that culture of sort of sleeping at the office and hard living, hard drinking. Is that a culture that you recognise in sort of AI data circles? And
well, yes, absolutely. But I mean, you raised finance, and I can't remember which bank it was, but I read one of the big banks recently were trying to cut down on hours. Actually, that they were sort of recognising there was huge burnout, and that they were instituting some policies to try and shift the expectations so that working hours would be shorter to improve the culture in the bank. I can't remember which. It was it was in finance, but...
I mean, I don't want to get all conspiracy theory about this, but if you looked at it in sort of old-fashioned power structures, those hours are there to marginalise certain groups, right? Or, why would you give up your cherry-picking access to the very best jobs, to the very best pay? So I wonder if you asked some of those 25-year-old, young men, would they want fewer hours? Are they quite enjoying this sort of, I'm probably a bit mean calling it macho, but this culture of code till we drop sort of thing?
But I mean, what you get, what I find quite striking in Silicon Valley is this. I think age is incredibly important, right? Because I've been on these panels with various people from Apple who are sort of much more like 50 now, and they're all on these panels with me saying, well, we didn't quite realise what we were doing, and actually we don't let our children use iPhones. We send them to schools where they're, so it is like a youthful, it's a kind of youth culture that's kind of being exploited, I think. And I think there is much more sort of recognition amongst kind of older folks that this isn't a good way to live, actually.
Yeah. Although probably they'd just say we were boomers and didn't get it, right?
Well, I think this book I wrote years ago about women and men in senior management, I remember interviewing senior managers who would talk to me a lot about regretting that they hadn't played a greater role as being fathers, right? That they would sort of regret this. And I was always wanting to say, but then why don't you change the policies for the men who are coming after you? It's that.
I think what we're talking about here across the piece is without diversity, you get some very unfortunate characteristics. I can just give you a stat about advertising in this country. So 80% of the wealth in the UK is held by the over 50s, and yet less than 20% of the advertising is targeted at the over 50s. And that is because all the media agencies are full of young people who quite frankly think of don't really think of older people at all as a target audience. And I think unless you have diversity, you have kind of weird outcomes like that all over the place. And it's and there's a good economic reason for gender diversity. There's McKinsey have done some work on this that say, I think it's like there's £150 billion missed out for the economy by women leaving the workplace. If we went on sort of for 5 years and none of those women left the workplace that we know are going to, it would generate £150 billion. So this isn't just about being nice and being inclusive. There are very good reasons to really go for diversity, and I do hope firms are beginning to get that, and I hope this bank that we can't remember is is a trailblazer. And
no, I think it's odd, isn't it? Because it's like there's a sort of gap between. I think there is a general recognition that diversity is incredibly important, because actually, people think about users and customers as being diverse, and so of course you want a diverse workforce to be able to think about that and produce things for those people. And yet there is this sort of gap between that kind of recognition and, enough of a serious attempt to think through policies that will make the difference in a way, And there's been, I'm sort of hesitant to say this, but, there's a lot of diversity work going on in a lot of industry. It's now a big area to have diversity people in human resources and all of these things. But, without really strong commitment from the top, actually, I think a lot of these policies aren't very effective in practice. It's the gap between, isn't it, policies and actually enacting them, having proper mentorship, sponsorship, and really leadership from the top, I think, to make change.
I think that's right. I think, and the top big government, and I'm sort of slightly dismayed by the lack of consideration of women's issues during this whole COVID crisis. The very little thought, I think, has been given, and it's been characterised by some of the messaging put out by government, which is very tin-eared, to the fact that women were really struggling during lockdown. On Mumsnet, we have a swearometer, which measures all the mentions of obscene words on the site, and it peaked every time the schools were announced as being closed, in some very violent way. And yet, when they were making policies around COVID, even to the extent, frankly, that pregnant women were very unsure about whether they could be vaxxed or not for quite a long time. There's very little messaging about that. There just seems to be a lack of thought around this stuff. And even more of a lack of thought with this government than with previous governments. So.
Well, I think that's true, but if I can broaden it out to kind of macroeconomics just for a minute, I mean, what I think is very interesting is how, the Biden government have got this huge infrastructure package, right? But actually, they have sort of thought through that actually, if you're going to put money into the economy, building roads, there are certain things that mean male jobs, actually, code for that. And they've been talking about care work as part of the infrastructure and supporting care. And so I think a very sort of different conception, really, of, where jobs are and where the jobs kind of need to be, rather than a kind of narrow idea of, well, if there's a crisis, let's pump money into construction and roads.
Yes.
Because we know, what sort of jobs they are.
Yeah, it's something that I've said for some time, really, which is our users absolutely agree that childcare, proper childcare in this country, is infrastructure.
Yes.
It's the infrastructure that helps families, negotiate that tricky time and means that women ultimately don't feel forced out of the workplace or to do reduced hours or all the rest of it. Thank you. I mean, I'm an employer as well as, let's say, an equality campaigner. So I feel your pain, and I don't want to be rude. I feel like I'm slagging off every single group now in turn. But there's a sort of joke about millennials that, they look at the clock and it's 5:30 and you've done some terrible injustice if they literally finish mid-sentence and leave. But and that's frustrating, and I agree with you. But I think what we're talking about is prolonged long hours, that culture of of going 12 hours a day every day, that certainly is not inclusive to anyone beyond who isn't a young person. I mean, I know from my own experience, I used to be able to work 12 hours a day. I can't now. I get a headache if I'm looking at the screen. And I also know it's not about hours, it's about outputs. And actually what we should really be doing is judging people on their outputs, not about their presenteeism. And that's the culture that I think we need to change. And your second point was about the bank. Yeah, I completely agree with that. So I'm on the board of Admiral, and I think it's the CEO whose bonus is tied in part, to their diversity targets. And actually, it's the thing that really moves the dial. And my only problem with these diversity targets is there always seems to be at 40%, not 50%. And I don't get that. But there you go. What do you think about that?
No, I mean, I completely agree. And actually, one of the companies I was studying years ago, for a short period, introduced bonuses, had a huge effect. Absolutely. I mean, they withdrew it because there was a backlash, but this is 20 years ago. But no, it's absolutely the kind of most effective thing.
I think you're right. And I think it's very difficult to change cultures without metrics in the same way we've talked about bonuses that really, really reflect what you want to change. On the plus side, because it's a slightly depressing snapshot you've given us, I do think one of the key enablers of women in the workplace and their progression is flexibility. And I think we have shifted to home working in a way that we will never fully shift back from. So there's an acceptance of flexibility and being able to do things via Zoom, et cetera, which will never, I mean, as hard as this government is trying to push us back, full-time back to where we came from, we will not, because what it's shown firms is you can do stuff like that. And in many ways, it's more efficient to not have your whole team have to fly over to America for 3 days, but you can do it by Zoom. So, and that is the biggest single thing that women say forces them out. It's that feeling that they can't work flexibly, that they can't deal with a child who has to be home sick from school, that it's that pressure. So I think let's be positive about that, at least, even though, maybe some of the welfare initiatives have slipped away.
I think you're completely right. And in my own work, I found exactly that it is middle management. And so that's even more kind of reason for why top management has to be persuasive about the seriousness with which they're pursuing these things. Because in my experience, where some of these diversity policies were being undermined was exactly kind of in middle management. I mean, I think the other point you've made, which is a very interesting one, is the sort of dominance of quantitative measurement of absolutely everything. We have it in universities, we have it absolutely everywhere. And I mean, I'm completely sympathetic with you about how this can be misused. I mean, I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, though, in a way, because I'm very against the quantitative measurements in so many ways, but actually when I think back to, it's that thing about always thinking back nostalgically to better periods or something. Actually, there were all sorts of kind of prejudices against women academics, for example, when we weren't measuring lots of things. And actually, in some ways, the measuring made it clear that these were prejudices. So I think it's a double-edged, it is a double-edged sword. And I mean, I guess our joint project here is to use data science, for social justice, to sort of improve things and not have it misused in that way, to reinforce old inequalities. I mean, that's a sort of great question and a many-leveled question. I mean, one of the things Fei Li says, who's head of Stanford sort of AI, is that, if you put data in that's kind of rubbish, I think she uses a better word than rubbish, but, it's kind of data in, data out. You know what I mean? Like, if you're putting in data based on historical discrimination and inequality, then the system that you're going to get is going to kind of reproduce that. So you have to be very clear about the nature of the data that you're putting in. And also there is still a very big gender data gap. One of the things sort of we're very concerned about is that there's lots of ways in which sort of data about women's health and in all sorts of areas hasn't been collected. It's not even there to kind of put in. So, one thing is data gaps, one thing is the nature of the data. And there's a big movement actually amongst AI professionals to think about kind of fairness and accountability in algorithms. And I mean, it's a long way to go, but I think that conversation is very much being had now.